My brother called me 2 days after our father's funeral, his voice practically vibrating with satisfaction, and told me without a shred of hesitation, "Dad left his full fortune to me. You're getting absolutely nothing. I guess he finally saw you clearly." I sat there, phone pressed to my ear, saying nothing for a long moment, because what my brother didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly known, was that our father had called me himself 3 weeks before he passed, and told me something entirely different. Stick with me, because the will my brother was so gleefully celebrating wasn't the only one our father had ever written. My name is Adrian Colby. I'm 29 years old, and for most of my adult life, my relationship with my father, Douglas Colby, existed in a strange, painful limbo, shaped almost entirely by my older brother's careful, patient manipulation. Wesley Colby, 33, had spent nearly a decade slowly poisoning our father's perception of me, feeding him a steady diet of exaggerations and outright fabrications about my supposed selfishness, my supposed neglect, my supposed ingratitude toward a man I had, in reality, tried repeatedly and consistently to reconnect with over the years. Our mother passed away when I was 19, an event that fractured our already fragile family in ways that took years to fully understand. Wesley, for years older and always closer to our father's temperament and business instincts, positioned himself immediately as our father's primary source of comfort and support during that grief, while subtly, gradually, framing my own grief and my own attempts to process our mother's death as evidence of emotional instability rather than genuine mourning. Over the following decade, Wesley controlled nearly every aspect of our father's information about me, intercepting messages, offering carefully edited accounts of conversations, discouraging visits under the guise of protecting our father's fragile health from what Wesley characterized as my unpredictable and draining presence. By the time our father's health began declining seriously roughly 2 years before his death, I had been almost entirely cut off from meaningful, unfiltered contact with him, my calls and visits carefully managed and minimized by a brother who had appointed himself the sole gatekeeper of our father's final years. What Wesley never anticipated in his careful decade-long campaign of quiet manipulation was that our father, in his final weeks, would find a way around him entirely, reaching out to me directly, secretly, with a message that would ultimately undo everything Wesley believed he'd successfully secured. To understand how Wesley managed to isolate me so thoroughly from our own father over the span of a decade, you have to understand the particular skill with which he'd always managed people, a skill that had served him well throughout his career in commercial insurance sales, and that he apparently applied with equal precision to his own family. Wesley had always been our father's more natural companion growing up, sharing his interest in golf, his particular sense of humor, his general comfort with traditional masculine bonding that I, quieter and more introspective even as a child, never quite fit into as easily. This natural closeness wasn't inherently a problem in our earlier years, but after our mother's death, Wesley began actively leveraging that closeness into something considerably more calculated. He started small, mentioning offhand comments to our father about my supposed struggles adjusting to independence after college, framing genuine, ordinary challenges I faced as evidence of deeper instability. He'd characterize my infrequent visits that grew infrequent specifically because Wesley consistently discouraged them under various pretexts, as evidence of my own disinterest in maintaining a relationship with our father, rather than acknowledging his own role in creating that distance. By the time our father's health began declining, developing a heart condition that required increasingly careful management, Wesley had positioned himself as the sole trusted intermediary managing our father's care, finances, and daily life. He moved into our father's house officially as a caretaker, though our father, still largely independent for much of that period, likely needed considerably less direct oversight than Wesley's presence implied to outside observers. I attempted several times over those 2 years to visit directly, to call without going through Wesley's careful scheduling, only to consistently find myself redirected, discouraged, told our father was resting or not feeling up to visitors during windows that somehow always seemed to align precisely with times I'd specifically planned to visit. I genuinely believed for far too long that my father's declining interest in contact with me reflected his own choice rather than Wesley's careful, systematic interference. It wasn't until the final months of our father's life that I began suspecting, with growing unease, that something considerably more deliberate than simple health-related limitations was shaping the distance between us. 3 weeks before our father passed away, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize, A call that turned out to be from Yolanda Ames, a home health nurse who had been quietly caring for our father during his final months, working hours that apparently didn't always overlap directly with Wesley's presence in the house. "Your father asked me to call you," she said, her voice careful, almost hesitant. "He wanted to speak with you directly, without anyone else present. He said it was important, and that he didn't have much time." I drove to my father's house that same afternoon, timing my visit specifically during a window Yolanda indicated Wesley would be away handling business matters related to his own insurance work. What followed was the first genuine, unfiltered conversation I'd had with my father in nearly 2 years. A conversation that revealed the full scope of Wesley's manipulation in ways that left me simultaneously devastated and finally, painfully clear about everything that had actually happened during those isolated years. My father, weakened considerably by his declining health but entirely lucid, told me directly that he'd begun suspecting over recent months that Wesley had been managing information between us far more selectively than he'd previously realized. He described specific instances where Wesley had discouraged visits, redirected phone calls, characterized my absence in ways that, upon reflection during his more isolated, contemplative final months, no longer made complete sense given what Yolanda had gently, carefully begun sharing with him about my repeated, genuine attempts to maintain contact. "I made a mistake," he told me that afternoon, his voice weak but resolute. "I let Wesley convince me of things about you that weren't true, because it was easier than questioning someone I trusted so completely. I want to fix that before it's too late." He told me that afternoon that he'd recently revised his will, working directly with a new attorney rather than the family attorney Wesley had always managed on his behalf, specifically to correct what he now understood had been a fundamentally unfair and manipulated understanding of our relationship. He asked me to trust him, to be patient, and to understand that whatever Wesley eventually told me after his death likely wouldn't reflect the whole truth. My father explained, during that secret visit, exactly how he'd arranged for his revised wishes to be documented properly, understanding clearly that Wesley's controlling influence over his affairs made a straightforward, conventional approach considerably more complicated than it should have been. He'd worked quietly with an independent attorney named Simone Pruitt, someone entirely unconnected to Gerald Dempsey, the family attorney Wesley had managed and directed for years regarding our father's estate planning. My father arranged several private meetings with Simone during periods when Wesley was reliably occupied with his own work commitments, using Yolanda's discreet assistance to coordinate timing that avoided any risk of Wesley discovering the revised documentation before he was ready to formalize everything properly. The new will, my father explained carefully, reflected his genuine wishes rather than the version Wesley had spent years subtly steering him toward. Rather than leaving his estate entirely to Wesley, as an earlier will, drafted years earlier under Wesley's watchful supervision, had specified, this revised document divided his estate equally between the two of us, along with a detailed personal letter explaining his reasoning and specifically addressing the manipulation he'd come to recognize, however belatedly, throughout our relationship's difficult recent years. "I know this might create real conflict with your brother," he told me that afternoon, his voice carrying genuine concern despite his physical weakness. "But I need you to understand that I finally see clearly what happened between us these past years, and I refuse to let my final decisions reflect a lie Wesley constructed, rather than the truth of who you actually are, and how genuinely you tried to remain close to me despite everything working against that effort." He told me the revised will had been properly witnessed and notarized, filed formally with Simone's office rather than through Gerald Dempsey's practice, specifically to avoid any risk of Wesley discovering or interfering with the documentation before our father's death made it legally binding and effective. I left that visit that afternoon carrying a complicated mixture of emotions, genuine grief over recognizing how much time Wesley's manipulation had cost my relationship with our father, profound relief at finally understanding I hadn't imagined the strange distance that had grown between us, and a cautious, uncertain hope regarding what might happen once Wesley eventually discovered this revised, more accurate reflection of our father's genuine wishes. My father passed away 3 weeks after that secret conversation, his health declining rapidly in his final days in a way that, according to Yolanda, was genuinely peaceful despite its relative suddenness. Wesley called to inform me of his passing, his voice carrying grief that felt, at least in that immediate moment, genuinely raw rather than calculated, a reminder that whatever else Wesley had done throughout our complicated family history, He had genuinely loved our father in his own way. The funeral itself unfolded with the particular tension of a family gathering, shaped by years of unspoken conflict, finally forced into shared physical space. Wesley managed most of the arrangements predictably, positioning himself as the primary point of contact for extended family and friends offering condolences, while I found myself navigating the day largely on the periphery, greeted warmly by relatives who clearly hadn't fully understood the extent of the distance Wesley's manipulation had created between our father and me over recent years. I said nothing that day about my final conversation with our father, or about the revised will I now knew existed somewhere in Simone Pruitt's office, waiting for its proper moment of formal disclosure. I focused instead on genuine grief, on saying goodbye to a father I'd only just begun rebuilding real connection with before his death arrived too quickly for that rebuilding to fully unfold the way I'd hoped it eventually might. Wesley, throughout the funeral, occasionally offered comments that carried an unmistakable undertone of ownership regarding our father's memory and legacy, subtle assumptions about handling the estate, about managing our father's remaining affairs, that made clear he fully expected to inherit everything according to the earlier will he'd carefully influenced years before. I let those assumptions stand uncorrected throughout that difficult day, understanding that whatever confrontation eventually needed to happen regarding our father's actual final wishes deserved a more appropriate setting than the raw, immediate grief of his funeral itself. 2 days later, sitting alone in my apartment processing the complicated grief of losing a father I'd only recently begun truly understanding again, I received Wesley's triumphant phone call, informing me with barely concealed satisfaction that our father had left his entire fortune to him, and that I would be receiving, in his words, absolutely nothing. I let Wesley finish his call that day without revealing anything about my final conversation with our father, or about the revised will waiting in Simone Pruitt's office. I simply told him calmly that I understood, and that I'd be in touch regarding practical matters related to closing out our father's affairs. Wesley, clearly expecting either devastated grief or angry confrontation, seemed almost thrown by my measured response, filling the silence with additional comments about how he'd always known our father would eventually see things clearly, language that revealed, unmistakably, exactly how thoroughly he still believed his years of manipulation had gone entirely undetected. I called Simone Pruitt directly the following morning, confirming the formal timeline for revealing our father's revised will to the family, a process that legally required a formal reading involving both beneficiaries, properly documented and witnessed, entirely separate from whatever informal assumptions Wesley had already begun operating under based on the outdated will he believed remained legally binding. Simone explained the situation carefully during our call, confirming that our father's revised will, properly executed and witnessed roughly a month before his death, entirely superseded the earlier document Wesley had helped orchestrate years earlier. She also mentioned something I hadn't previously known. Our father had specifically requested that Gerald Dempsey, the family attorney Wesley had always trusted and directed, not be involved in any capacity with the will's formal reading, given legitimate concerns about potential conflicts of interest considering Gerald's years of close professional relationship with Wesley specifically. Your father was very deliberate about this, Simone told me. He wanted to make absolutely certain his genuine final wishes would be protected and properly executed, without any risk of interference or manipulation during the formal process. I scheduled the formal will reading for the following week, informing Wesley simply that Simone Pruitt's office would be handling our father's estate matters going forward, a detail that, based on Wesley's confused, slightly defensive response, clearly registered as unexpected and unwelcome given his assumption that Gerald Dempsey would naturally continue managing everything as he always had throughout our father's life. I spent that week preparing carefully for a conversation I knew would fundamentally alter whatever relationship remained between Wesley and me, understanding that revealing the truth about our father's genuine final wishes would also, unavoidably, reveal the full extent of manipulation Wesley had spent nearly a decade carefully constructing. Wesley arrived at Simone Pruitt's office the following week visibly confused and increasingly agitated, clearly having expected this meeting to simply confirm the earlier will's provisions through unfamiliar administrative channels, rather than representing anything more significant than a procedural formality. Simone conducted the reading with careful, deliberate professionalism, walking through our father's revised will methodically, beginning with the formal declaration that this document, properly executed and witnessed 1 month before our father's death, entirely superseded any earlier documents, including whatever version Wesley had been operating under since his initial triumphant phone call. I watched Wesley's face shift through disbelief, confusion, and finally unmistakable panic as Simone continued reading, detailing our father's decision to divide his estate equally between us, along with the personal letter our father had specifically requested be read aloud during this formal proceeding. The letter itself, written in our father's own words during those final weeks, addressed Wesley directly with a clarity and honesty that clearly devastated him in ways I hadn't fully anticipated witnessing in person. Our father acknowledged, explicitly, his growing awareness of Wesley's manipulation throughout recent years, expressing genuine regret over how thoroughly he'd allowed that manipulation to distort his relationship with me, while also expressing genuine love for Wesley himself, framing this revised will not as punishment, but as a final, necessary correction toward fairness, he felt obligated to make while he still had the capacity to do so. "This isn't real," Wesley said, his voice cracking as Simone finished reading. "Dad wouldn't have done this without talking to me directly. Someone manipulated him. Someone took advantage of him being sick and vulnerable. I spoke with him directly in person several times during his final months," Simone said calmly, professionally. "Your father was entirely lucid and clear about his wishes throughout this entire process. I have documentation, witness statements, and video recordings from our formal signing session specifically anticipating exactly this kind of challenge to the will's validity. I watched Wesley's carefully constructed narrative about our family, about my supposed instability and disinterest, about his own position as our father's sole trusted confidant, crumble entirely in real time, replaced by the genuine documented truth our father had worked so deliberately to protect during his final weeks. The weeks following that formal reading proved genuinely difficult for Wesley, forcing him to confront, publicly and undeniably, the full scope of manipulation our father's letter had explicitly documented and condemned. Wesley initially attempted to contest the will's validity, hiring an attorney to explore potential legal challenges regarding our father's mental capacity during those final months. Simone, anticipating exactly this response, had ensured meticulous documentation throughout the entire process, medical evaluations confirming our father's full mental capacity at the time of signing, video recordings of the formal execution, detailed notes from multiple meetings demonstrating consistent, clear articulation of his wishes over an extended period rather than any single, potentially vulnerable moment. Wesley's legal challenge collapsed within weeks, the evidence simply too thorough and carefully documented to support any credible claim of manipulation or diminished capacity. The formal collapse of his challenge, combined with the letter's explicit public acknowledgement of his manipulation, began reshaping how extended family and mutual friends understood our complicated family history, many of them reaching out to me directly during those weeks, apologizing for years of unconsciously accepting Wesley's version of events without ever questioning it more carefully. Wesley's marriage, already strained by financial pressures related to some ambitious but ultimately unsuccessful investment decisions he'd made in recent years, began visibly cracking under this additional weight, his wife reportedly struggling to reconcile the version of Wesley she'd believed she'd married with the explicit manipulation our father's letter had documented so clearly and publicly. I didn't personally orchestrate any of these consequences, beyond simply allowing our father's genuine, documented final wishes to unfold according to proper legal process. But I won't pretend I didn't feel a complicated mixture of vindication and genuine sadness watching a decade of careful manipulation finally collapse under the weight of truth our father had worked so deliberately, during his final weeks, to protect and preserve. Wesley eventually reached out directly, roughly 2 months after the formal reading, requesting a private conversation that felt, for the first time in years, genuinely vulnerable rather than calculated. Wesley and I met at a quiet coffee shop, neither of our usual family gathering spaces, somewhere neutral enough that felt appropriate for the genuinely difficult conversation we both understood needed to happen. He looked considerably diminished from the confident, triumphant brother who'd called me 2 days after our father's funeral, something in his posture and expression reflecting weeks of genuine reckoning with consequences he clearly hadn't anticipated when he'd spent years carefully managing our father's perception of me. "I don't fully understand how it started," he admitted, staring at his coffee rather than at me directly. "I think at first after Mom died I genuinely believed I was protecting Dad from additional stress, that your grief seemed more chaotic than mine, and I convinced myself limiting contact was somehow helpful rather than harmful. But somewhere along the way, I think I started actually believing my own version of events, rather than recognizing I'd essentially constructed it. I listened carefully, genuinely wanting to understand, even as I remained cautious about extending full forgiveness too quickly given the genuine harm nearly a decade of manipulation had caused, both to my relationship with our father and to my own understanding of my worth within our family. "I'm not asking you to just forget everything," Wesley said, finally meeting my eyes directly. "I know I can't undo years of keeping you away from Dad, or the version of you I convinced him existed instead of who you actually are. I just want you to know I understand now fully exactly what I did, and exactly how much it cost both of us, not just you." I appreciated that acknowledgement, imperfect and belated as it was, more than I expected to. It didn't erase years of manufactured distance from our father, or the particular cruelty of that triumphant phone call following his funeral, but it represented, genuinely, the beginning of Wesley reckoning with a pattern he'd spent nearly a decade refusing to examine honestly. We didn't fully reconcile during that conversation, understanding correctly that genuine trust would require considerably more time and consistent effort than any single conversation could provide. But we agreed, tentatively, to attempt rebuilding some version of an honest relationship, one no longer shaped by manipulation or carefully managed narratives. A year after that difficult reading in Simone Pruitt's office, I established a small scholarship fund in our father's name, supporting young people navigating complicated family estrangement and reconciliation, using a portion of my inheritance to build something meaningful out of the painful circumstances surrounding his final years and the manipulation that had so thoroughly shaped them. Wesley and I remained in careful, gradually improving contact throughout that year, our relationship rebuilding slowly, imperfectly, marked by genuine effort on both sides rather than any dramatic, complete transformation. He attended the scholarship fund's small launch event, standing quietly at the back of the room, and afterward told me it represented exactly the kind of person our father had always hoped I might become, a comment that carried genuine warmth rather than any lingering resentment about the inheritance division that had initially triggered his own difficult reckoning. I thought often, throughout that year, about our father's final weeks, about his quiet, deliberate determination to correct a decade of manipulation despite his own declining health and limited remaining time. That determination, I came to understand, represented his own final meaningful act of love, not simply toward me, in ensuring I received fair treatment his will could finally guarantee, but toward truth itself, toward refusing to let his final legacy reflect a lie Wesley had constructed rather than the actual complicated, imperfect reality of our family. Yolanda Ames, the nurse whose quiet courage had made that final secret conversation with our father possible, remained someone I stayed genuinely connected with throughout that year, grateful in ways I could never fully articulate for her willingness to risk Wesley's displeasure in service of what she recognized, correctly, as our father's genuine final wishes. Standing at that scholarship launch event, thinking about everything that had unfolded since that triumphant, cruel phone call informing me I'd receive absolutely nothing, I felt something considerably more valuable than the inheritance itself had ultimately provided: genuine clarity about my own worth, hard-won through years of manipulation finally thoroughly exposed, and a complicated but genuine path toward rebuilding real relationship with the brother whose own reckoning had, ultimately, proven at least as meaningful as whatever our father's estate had formally divided between us.